get to meet Stephen. He would not only serve under Henry, but he would also serve Henry's sons and, in fact, Henry's grandson. As far as English history goes, the family of Henry II are in many respects well known even to today. There is Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's wife, and certainly powerful in her own right. Henry's sons, arguably the least well known of them would be his second son. His eldest son died quite young, and it would be his second son Henry, who had become known during Henry II's own lifetime as the young king. And I'll refer to the old king and the young king in this presentation as they did to kind of keep straight who is who. William Marshal would serve directly in Henry the young king's household as both a military tutor as well as a trusted subordinate later. It was not common in England to crown a successor during a king's lifetime. That was common in France and in the continent at the time. Henry is going to experiment that. Henry the old king is going to experiment with that by crowning Henry the young king. It will not go well, and the young king will be the only succeeding English monarch crowned during a existing king's lifetime. But William Marshal is also going to be intimately connected with Henry's third son, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, and part of that story as well. And we will continue that tale with Richard I and their connections. He probably did not have as close relationship with Henry's fourth son, Geoffrey, Geoffrey of Anjou, but certainly would have known him and certainly would have been face to face to him quite a bit. Geoffrey is not as well known today, although he's going to figure heavily in our story, largely because of his claims, or at least his son's claims, to the English throne after Richard I's death. His Geoffrey's son, Arthur of Brittany, interestingly, could have been an English monarch, another English monarch named King Arthur, but will never serve in that capacity. And William Marshal is partly responsible for that. And of course, the infamous King John, Lackland, Soft Sword, all kinds of great nicknames for King John. I love Matthew Paris's illustration of him on the right with the crown slightly askew and the finger up-pointed, clearly trying to control a empire that he is unable to maintain during his lifetime. And even John's son, who will become the rule as Henry III, will have close connections with William Marshal himself. So let's talk about the Marshal, his background, and why his story is so amazing. We actually know so much about William Marshal because there was a contemporary, or at least in the lifetime of William Marshal's sons, a biography written of him, which is, not only is it remarkable that was an actual biography, it was written in verse in Norman French. Not only is there a biography written of him, but a copy of it has survived and has formed the basis for a lot of the research on William Marshal's lifetime. Now, as a biography probably written for one of William Marshal's sons about his father's lifetime, it is a largely rosy picture of his lifetime and may gloss over some of the less flattering characteristics of him, but it certainly does provide a lot of information about someone who is not the type of person that would have featured heavily in a lot of the commentators of his day. Most of the written records that we have of individuals in this period come from monastic records, and they're mostly concerned with kings and rulers, and although individuals such as knights and barons are mentioned as well, you don't get the same level of detail from those sources because it's not what the monks who are writing are particularly interested in relating, except as it fits into the story of what they're trying to tell. But William Marshal does creep up in them. You can find part of the bureaucracy of the government at this time. You start to have more things written down during Henry the Old King's lifetime that will continue in Richard's and John's reigns. And so William Marshal's name will feature in those as a witness to various documents, including Magna Carta, and carry through as well. So there's actually a pretty rich written record of his life, which is, again, pretty unique for individuals who are not directly of the royal family during this period. He was certainly well known during his lifetime. There's sort of a period then where he falls out of the historical narrative and doesn't get mentioned. But starting in the Victorian era, he's sort of rediscovered by those who are writing about English history and gives more information about his lifetime, and he sort of returns to the story during those periods. Just catching up with chat. Don't worry, I will show the images on the first slide will come back up again many times. So we will return to them. I would love to do a presentation just on Eleanor of Aquitaine. She is in some ways even more challenging to directly talk about than individuals like William Marshal because of the bias of her time. Most of the information we have about her is in connection to other people rather than her own story, which makes it a little bit of a challenge, but certainly worthy of conversation. We're going to talk a lot about Eleanor of Aquitaine today because more than any one person, she is probably responsible for setting William Marshal on the path that he will succeed later in his life. I'm a big Eleanor of Aquitaine fan. So I'm always happy to talk about her. One of the things that is so profound is for a person who's so immensely influential during her own lifetime, we don't even have a physical description of what she looked like that is contemporary. So her story is thread through the gaps of the actual story of her life itself. But very, very much a fascinating person to discuss. All right, so William Marshal is born in the middle of what is known as the Anarchy. This is that great struggle between Stephen, King of England, and the Empress Matilda. If any of you are mystery fans and know the Cadfael stories, they are set during this time period. It is featured in a number of different novels. And makes for a very captivating story. Pillars of the Earth takes place during the same time period. So there's a lot of historical fiction that uses it as a backdrop because the characters during this period are colorful. There is a lot of conflict, and so it makes a rich background for telling a story, and so a good background for telling the story of William Marshal himself. William Marshal's father, John Marshal, was a relatively important minor lord, which may sound like a bit of a contradiction. He was not in the top tier of the nobility. You could even debate whether he could be considered a baron of the realm or not. But he was certainly an effective warrior. And like so many other individuals, when the sort of constraints of government and boundaries of society get shaken during this period, he takes the opportunity to enrich himself and increase his own power. In the biography of William Marshal, he is described in very positive terms, but a lot of other contemporary records are not quite as glowing for him. He was relatively infamous for having lost an eye and arguably had a very striking physical presence that certainly would have been influential at the time. The best account for that we have is that in conflict, while he was supporting Empress Matilda against King Stephen, that he was caught in a burning church, and burning lead from the roof mangled his eye. And so that certainly would have been a very striking physical presence. He had several sons or several children by a first marriage. During the anarchy, he is going to cast off his first wife and marry a second for political reasons, something that was not uncommon in the nobility at the time. And William Marshal is going to be a second son from a second marriage. And so in that perspective, relatively far down on the line of being able to actually inherit or gain any political power. Was there a question?
No question. I just forgot to mute somebody. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. All right, so during the anarchy, John Marshal is going to control a castle or build a castle at Newbury, which controlled a relatively significant ford. There is going to be conflict over this. King Stephen is going to approach with his army and lay siege to this castle. John Marshal is not going to be present when the siege begins, and so he's going to go to King Stephen, who was known for being arguably too reasonable and in some ways too kind, as we'll see, to be an effective military or effective medieval king. And John Marshal is going to ask King Stephen if he can approach the castle himself through the siege lines, ostensibly at least to arrange for the surrender of the castle. And Stephen will agree on the condition that John Marshal provides a hostage, and John Marshal is going to provide his second son, William Marshal, as the hostage for the surety of the surrender of the castle. No sooner is that, and this was not unusual, you would give hostages in order to guarantee promises. Very common in any kind of treaty in the medieval era. And it was very much understood that if you backed out of your side of the deal, that the hostages were forfeit, their lives, potentially. So John Marshal is going to no sooner get into Newbury Castle than he is going to immediately start reinforcing it and reorganizing the defense. And so King Stephen is going to threaten to John Marshal to execute his son William. John Marshal supposedly responded to go ahead and kill William Marshal because he had the anvils and hammers to forge even finer sons. So you get a kind of idea of John Marshal's character from how willing he is to cast off the life of his son. Now, he may have been banking on King Stephen's clemency, and he may not. The stories that are told of this incident are that Stephen basically brought William Marshal forward in front of the castle to execute him and try to execute him twice. And that both times the young William Marshal managed to charm King Stephen into not executing him and preserving his life. Whether or not the stories as written in William Marshal's biography are 100% historically factual, we get a sense through William Marshal's lifetime of the fact that this was sort of a foundational element to the story of his own life and his own growth. That he was, he apparently would tell the story of being held as a hostage in King Stephen's company later in life. He would claim that he and King Stephen played a game of knights using reeds as swords. And one of the things that is interesting through William Marshal's own lifetime is that whenever he was called upon to give hostages for promises made, he was very careful in the hostages that he gave and the promises that he made. Whether or not this was just simply his understanding of the medieval world, or whether it was a remnant from this incident in his youth, we certainly can't say today. But it seems that there was definitely a thread of these moments in his young life that continued as he continued to grow older and be in the position where he had to make promises and give hostages himself. So as young William Marshal grows up, the anarchy is going to end. William II is, Henry II is going to become the King of France. And as young William Marshal grows up, as a younger son of the nobility, he is destined to be one of the mounted warriors of his day, a knight. And in order to do that, he is going to have to be trained in order to gain the capacity to serve in that role. If you were in the nobility, particularly in the upper nobility of this period, the way that you would learn how to become a knight would be by serving in another lord's household, usually a family member, but it would be very rare that you would be trained as a knight if you were of the upper nobility in your own household. Certainly not necessarily the same for those of sort of more modest situations. But John Marshal was high enough placed that he could call upon his some of his wife's family in this case to serve as a training ground for young William Marshal. And so this will be the first time that William Marshal will cross the English Channel and go to Normandy, where he's going to spend much of his life. And he's going to be trained as a knight in the household of William of Tankerville, who was renowned in the time for essentially for preparing young men as mounted warriors, as knightly warriors. William Marshal's start in his learning how to be a knight would have been one of service. The way in the medieval mind, at least, you learned how to become a leader and how to rule and make decisions by first serving others. And so if you were, if your destiny was to serve as a knight in the nobility, then you would act as, we would think of them today as pages or squires. Those terms and the understanding of them are developing at this point. So our concept of, you know, a young man as a squire is in training to become a knight is not how they would have understood the term during the period. But that's very much the path that William Marshal himself is going to follow. He was described as being quite tall, being very well formed, and as having a crotch so large that no noble could be his peer. Probably not meaning it the way that we would interpret today, but meaning that his hips and his seat were well suited for riding, for being on horseback. As he is training in William of Tankerville's household, he becomes known as Gastavandier or Greedy Guts. So apparently he liked a good meal, and he himself apparently described his own characteristics in his youth as being quite lazy. Which for someone who becomes so active later in his life is sort of striking. Whether that was sort of self-deprecating humor is hard to say. But as would have been reasonable during his lifetime, when he reaches 21, he is going to be knighted. And apparently his knighting was less the formal ceremony that was starting to become very popular at the time than a relatively quick affair because trouble was brewing in Normandy. There were rebellions afoot, and Baron William of Tankerville needed to raise his own force of knights to help fight the rebels in these rebellions. And this is going to be William Marshal's first taste of combat, and that will come at Neufchâteau in 1166. By all accounts, even contemporary ones not connected to William Marshal's own history, he did quite well during the battle. And we'll talk a little bit more about knighthood and the skills of that in just a second. But he had a very firm grasp of really what made an effective knight, which were two things: being able to ride a horse incredibly well, and having great strength and great power in being able to use the weapons of the time. And so in this conflict at Neufchâteau, he is going to at one point be cut off from the rest of William of Tankerville's forces. He is going to back himself into an alleyway and charge out into the melee, yelling Tankerville, Tankerville, and routing the rebellious opposing knights, and be quite successful militarily. He's later going to try this apparently again in the same battle, and in doing so is going to lose his horse. His horse will be mortally wounded. And he's going to end up learning a very hard lesson from this battle, because at the end of the fighting, while the stories of his bravery and his effectiveness in combat are being told around the camp, he has neglected arguably the most important thing for a knight to do in combat. And that is, he has taken no opponents as prisoner for ransom, and he has therefore gained no military equipment from this battle. So when looking at medieval knighthood, particularly in this period, you could be very effective in combat, but unless you are also bringing in financial security, you're not going to be successful in maintaining your position. And that is going to be what happens to William Marshal in his first battle. He will be renowned for his combat abilities and ridiculed after the battle for taking no significant enemy prizes, whether they be equipment, individuals, or booty out of the conflict. This seems shockingly sort of self-serving and I'm losing the word that I'm looking for here. Self-serving and maybe greedy from our perspective today. But it was understood to be one of the things that was that you were required to do as a knight. You were in some way self-sustaining of your own military equipment. And if not, then you had to be at the beck and call of a lord to provide that equipment for you. And if you were not providing any financial resources to your lord, then you may not get things, you may not get some of the support from your lord in return. So let's take a look at knighthood in the 12th and 13th century. And if you'll excuse the imagery here, I am, in addition to being an educator and historian, also a medieval reenactor with the Company of Little Dunmow, which represents one of the forces fighting in the Magna Carta War. So equipment that would have been very much key to this time period. So I've thrown up some images of myself and my compatriots doing what we do. What did it mean to be a knight in the 12th and 13th century? Well, the concept that we would have of knighthood, and let me just check and see if there's any other questions. Okay, doesn't look like there's anything specific right now. Oh, great question, Lisa, on knighting and what knighting means. The answer is yes, because it has not yet, knighthood, the concept of knighthood has not yet coalesced into the passage that we would think of it today and sort of in the medieval period. And William Marshal's lifetime encompasses this shift in what knighthood means. At the time of his birth, being a knight simply was, in many respects, a job description. It meant that you were a warrior who was trained to fight on horseback with the most up-to-date military equipment that you could possibly afford. By the time of his death, being a knight had gained some of the chivalric meanings that we think of knights as having today, a code of honor, the idea that you were of a higher status in society simply by being knighted, and that this carried profound, deeper meanings to how you had to live your own life. And in many respects, William Marshal, even contemporarily, was the model for those various meanings and understanding those pieces. So, for example, at the time of the anarchy, the terms used in England for a knight could be knight, as we understand it today, which has its Germanic connections to servant. It could be as a melite, which would be understood as being a mounted warrior. The idea of this having some other meaning other than simply being a soldier fighting on horseback had not yet really pulled together. By the time of William Marshal's death, the concept and understanding and the term chivalry starts to mean what we think of it today, which is not what chivalry originally meant, because chivalry itself is a term, chevalerie, cheval, horse, comes from an understanding of the skills needed to ride a horse into combat. A mounted knight on the battlefield in the 12th and the 13th century was truly an awesome piece of military equipment. Parallels could be made to thinking of it as a tank on the modern battlefield. I mean, you can carry those kind of analogies, far too far. But the idea that you were reasonably impervious to the weapons of the time while being able to inflict huge amounts of damage certainly was true. And in terms of military equipment, you're going to see this transition during William Marshal's lifetime as well. When he is born, the most common types of helmets are nasal helms or helms with simple faceplates. By the time of his death, you have a fully enclosed medieval helmet covering the entire face. At the time of William Marshal's birth, the chainmail armor worn by a knight probably would extend to the wrists. By the time of his death, a knight is going to be completely encased in mail. At the time of William Marshal's birth, the idea of the mounted charge with a lance couched under your arm so that you're placing the entire weight of your horse and rider behind the point of that lance is certainly understood, but as a locked together connection between the point of the weapon to the rider to the horse has not come into its own the way that it will by the time of his death. And so all of these various pieces are part of the military transition of his day. It's easy to think of knights, guys in armor with swords clubbing at each other as being sort of a fixed piece of military equipment, and that's certainly not true. There are great adaptations in warfare during this period, as well as even just the military hardware being used. Part of the challenges of being a mounted warrior are the creation of the social hierarchy that knights are going to use. As a mounted warrior, the skills that you need to be effective and the body conditioning that you need to be successful in doing this are quite profound. Riding horses, just pleasure riding, is not a simple task. Riding a stallion into combat is certainly not an easy task, particularly when one of your arms is holding a reasonably heavy shield and the other arm is wielding a weapon. You're controlling your horse with your seat, with your leg, with your spur. Certainly rein control existed, but you can't use your weapons and your reins effectively at the same time to solely control your horse. If anybody is familiar with modern dressage riding and the various ways of, in the modern sport, almost making a horse dance simply through minor control of your body, these were all skills that a mounted warrior needed to be an effective combatant in warfare. And one of the important factors of William Marshal and his success is going to be his amazing horsemanship throughout his life in being able to use all those pieces. Now, if you are in a job that requires you to have a profound understanding of a physical skill, the only way that you're going to be effective in doing that is if you are constantly practicing. And if you are constantly riding and you are constantly training with weapons, then you cannot serve other roles in life, particularly in your youth when you're most effective in those military forms, other than doing that training. And so one of the reasons that knighthood becomes solely solidified in that upper class world is that you need to have the resources to be able to support that. And when we talk about feudalism as an economic and political system, originally at least, feudalism grows, where you have a lord who is served by peasants under them in a system, that system grows to be able to provide the resources to put a mounted warrior into combat by the labor of those who are peasants or considered from a lower place in society, to be able to provide the resources to actually have someone train effectively to become a mounted warrior. Now, once you get a system where the economic system and the social system are supporting the mounted warrior as being of a higher status, then all of a sudden you start to get ceremony and to use the archaeological, anthropological catch-all, ritual built into the system to help support that system in existing in and of itself. And that's where you start to see ceremonies of knighthood becoming important. Because if you're of a relatively high level in society, you have a unique skill set that puts you above, in your mind, and arguably in reality, other kinds of warriors and other kinds of people in society, then all of a sudden what you're doing means something more than just living a normal life. And the various trappings that you build into that start to become more of a ceremony and have more importance. And what's interesting about that rise of knighthood is at the same time that you are getting knighthood as a thing becoming more ceremonial, you're also seeing a decline in the number of people serving in that role, because it becomes more expensive to become a knight. Both the equipment is more expensive as well as the ceremony involved. The various pieces that you need to do in the social fabric to be able to maintain yourself in that situation start to become more exclusive. And so you start to see things like 2 generations later during Edward I's reign, where you have the very first knighting ceremonies with the pomp and circumstance that transfers into the modern world, leading into things like the Order of the Garter and those modern institutions growing out of it. You also start to see individuals refusing to serve in that role because of the expense, because not everybody who is of noble birth really wants to serve as a mounted warrior on the battlefield. And so knighthood becomes more and more selective as it grows in prominence in society, if that makes sense. But that's going on throughout this period. And you start to see a divide between, this is a knight, this is a professional mounted warrior who can essentially do the same things as a knight without the cultural background behind it going on at the same time. And that is the world in which William Marshal lives, and in which he sort of sets the model for his time period. 2 concepts that grow out of that are proudhume, which is being the right sort of man, and the familiae, which is not the family as we would think of it today. Sometimes even the period, the term mense is used as well, but is your military family. It's a family, a military family, as the Romans and as Napoleon and as modern military staffs would understand it. This is the group of individuals who you serve with in a military capacity. And these 2 concepts connect to each other. You have to live a certain kind of way, and in doing that, you give service to others, and you are responsible for the people who are under you, and you are responsible for their maintenance, and you are responsible for the gifts and the largesse that you show to those who serve you. And those are going to be pieces that are profoundly influential in William Marshal's lifetime. He is both the recipient of great honors because of the military families to which he belongs, as well as later in his own life creating his own military family and instilling those goals on others as well. And one of the things that is going to dominate the future story of William Marshal as we tell it is going to be loyalty, particularly loyalty to his monarch. Oftentimes loyalty to monarchs who probably did not deserve the loyalty that he gave them. All right, I'm going to take a quick pause to check and see if we've got other questions. So would knighthood bring land or estates? Possibly, but not necessarily. there are, and arguably it'll be easier to give an example by looking at William Marshal's own life, and how he grows in his estates, than it will be to try to make sort of a catch-all statement. But if you were serving as a knight, at least in as we understand it in sort of the modern viewpoint, knighthood kind of breaks down into two kind of knights. This is oversimplistic, and the exceptions prove the rules. But generally, knights either serve as household knights or they serve as landed knights. And the difference is, if you are a household knight, you are directly serving in the military service of your lord. You probably do not have lands of your own. You're probably being supported by your lord through his gifts and his lands, although there are ways for you to make your own fortunes as well. If you are a landed knight, then you have been given a manor that you may serve as the head of. And the lines between these two can be very, very blurred. There's Stephen Church, and it's very hard to find a copy of it today, but he wrote a monograph on the household knights of King John. And one of the stories that is very much present through, and this is the household of the king, is that the young men who were King John's knights remained very loyal to him until he was unable to provide the financial backing or the lands or the largesse that they expected as being his knights. And then they start in the middle of the Barons' War to slip to the opposition. There are lots of estimates about how many serving knights are in England. You sometimes hear that there's somewhere around 3,000 serving knights in England during the start of John's reign. It is not uncommon to see, for a large military force of the medieval ages, and this is full of pitfalls because medieval chroniclers used numbers to tell the story rather than as an actual estimate of military force. You don't start really getting a handle on military force until Edward I's reign, where you start to have documentation, more documentation. One of the things that starts in John's reign is that for the first time, the royal clerks start recording the letters that are sent from the king out. As John's son Henry and Henry's son Edward's reigns continues, the royal clerks start also recording the letters coming in. And it's not until we get the letters coming in and the letters coming out in what we call today the pipe rolls that you start to get a better picture of the military structure of the time. But you could expect several thousand foot soldiers with several hundred knights in a relatively large military force. That's going to vary greatly depending on who and when and why. But that would not necessarily be atypical. Knighthood grows across Western Europe during this period. Knighthood really grows out of late Roman cavalry tradition. The feudalism as it grows throughout Western Europe largely builds off of the fall of the Roman Empire and a shift to a more agrarian and less urban society, but still needing a way to support mounted warriors who have sort of started to become more influential during the late Roman period. Starting in about, between 900, 1000, you start seeing the stirrup become more common as military equipment. Stirrups are absolutely amazing and fundamental to being able to fight effectively on horseback because they solidify your seat on your horse much better than you can without them. And they allow you to put a lot more force into your weapons without ending up throwing yourself out of your own saddle. And so as you get the mounted warrior growing, it grows across Europe. And you can make a strong case that it's really the Normans who turn it into a profoundly world-beating weapon, if that makes any sense. It's not
Andrew,
quite.
Andrew,
Yes,
I have a question. Sorry to interrupt. This was
absolutely.
bothering me for a while. Remember when we did the presentation on the Teutonic Knights? So the Teutonic
Yes.
Knights were not allowed to marry, right? They, what do they call the celibacy that they had to? What about the regular knights? Were they around? Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So regular knights not only would be allowed to marry, but it would have been one of your paths to increasing your status would be to get a good marriage. It is the key to making William Marshal more than just a household knight, is going to be his marriage. So certainly that was allowed. One of the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller all grow out to some degree or another of monastic traditions as well as military traditions. And so you start to see elements of monastic lifestyles in addition to the military lifestyle that are, and Jonathan could speak to this far better than I ever could. That's where you see some of the prohibitions on marriage and things of that nature. That's a connection to their religious and monasterial existence rather than just their military existence.
Right. And one last comment I wanted to make is recently watched this movie called Lost Duel. I don't know if anybody watched it. Really good movie. And Matt Damon and Ben Affleck in that movie. And Matt Damon's playing this guy, John the Courageous, and they show the life of the knighthood and how defends the honor. I don't want to get into much. I don't want to spoil the movie for them, but if anybody wants to watch that, it's an incredible movie. Sorry, I'm going to digress.
Just take the military equipment with a lighthearted look.
Oh, you saw the movie?
Shall we say?
You saw the movie?
I have not seen it simply because I have seen the trailers, and I need to come to grips with going in with the understanding that what I'm going to see is not going to be the medieval world as it looked.
Got it.
Unfortunately, it follows the path of, we think we can make modern understandings of medieval clothing and armor that look better than what they actually had, while losing some of the amazing beauty that existed during the actual period. And there's a profound need in modern movie making to make the medieval world look brown and drab and dingy and dark. And that's totally counter to all the imagery we have of the medieval world. They absolutely loved color. And not only, so give a good example. If you look at the image of me and my armor and equipment with the blue shield in the lower picture, with a bright golden silk surcoat, well, why on earth are you going to wear, that's arguably the most single expensive object in the medieval world that you see in that picture would be that silken surcoat. Why would somebody wear that into combat? Well, because it's showing that you have the access to the wealth and the resources to be able to own something so precious and use it to show your status on the battlefield. And it does a couple of things. It not only shows that you are a person of substance and status, but it also, we mentioned ransom and hostage, it shows that you are somebody it's not valuable to kill you, it is more valuable to take you prisoner. And so those elements would have been very much in the forethought of the medieval mind. If you had the money for it, you would have as much color in your life as possible. And you only need to look at medieval illuminated manuscripts to gain a sense of that. Not that even medieval drawings necessarily reflect the world as it existed, but it certainly reflected the world as they wished to show it. And they wished to show a world of bright color and great diversity and great show. And so this is one of, I mean, you could get me talking about issues with medieval movies for hours, which is not our purpose here. But it is one of the most disappointing things about most medieval movies is how sad they made the medieval world look. And I'm not saying that the medieval world did not have its sadness and did not have its darkness, but in the visual terms, they certainly loved color and they certainly loved beautiful things. And we only need to look at medieval art to be able to see that. About the only film that gives you somewhat of a sense, and it has its own issues as all films do, is The Outlaw King, where there's a great scene where they step out of the tent into sunlight and you suddenly realize that everybody's wearing all these vibrant colors. And that is the medieval world as they would have understood it at the time. But that's a little bit of a digression. So one of the things that grows in William Marshal's time, and one of the things that helps lead to his later success, is the medieval tournament. If you want to get a sense of the excitement and enjoyment of the medieval tournament as it started to grow during William Marshal's lifetime, watch the movie A Knight's Tale. It is campy. Don't take it as historical fact, but it gets the sense of the excitement, the sense of the show, and the idea that you had a sports circuit that you could follow as a knight and make a living on, completely detached from warfare or from the rest of the medieval world in and of its own right. Now, tournaments as they existed during William Marshal's lifetime were not what we think of today, and certainly were not what is depicted in movies like A Knight's Tale. You didn't have two knights on either side of a tilt barrier who were riding at each other with their lances couched over the left side of the horse in some kind of single combat. Tournaments as they existed in the 12th century and would grow in the 13th century were essentially warfare, but they were warfare simply for the purpose of training, of riding in the field, of gaining money, and of the sheer joy of the sport of combat, rather than being warfare for other purposes as well. Both the church.
Andrew, was there a connection to the gladiator performances, or this was nothing to do with that?
No, and vastly different as they started from what we would think of a gladiatorial performance, and also, in looking at the evolution of knighthood, the early tournaments, you did not have spectators, and if you did have spectators, they probably didn't see much, because what essentially happens at medieval tournaments in this period is the tournament field was miles of ground, and you essentially had two armies that showed up on either side of the field, would charge at each other for the initial melee, and then the fight would break up into cross-country warfare. And in fact, the name itself comes from the actions of mounted knights turning their horses in combat, because you would ride in your attack. Once you had ridden through your initial assault, you would turn your horse to re-engage. You would turn your horse to get a new lance if you had broken your lance. That was the essential element, that whirling action of the combat, which gives it its name. But you didn't do it for spectators. The spectators were the participants. You did it to show off to your peers. You did it to prove yourself. You did it to make your own money. But at least in these early forms, you're not doing it for the adoration of graceful ladies in the crowd. That comes later. And tournaments, as we understand them, or as we think of them today in terms of a display for a crowd, grow in popularity as the actual use of those skills as a combat tool starts to subside. And so if you go to a Renaissance festival today and you see people who are actually jousting in a tournament sense, or if you see individuals like Dr. Tobias Capwell, who does, and there are quite a few others as well, who do modern tournaments, they are based far more on the late and almost post-medieval concept of what a tournament is, in that it is a show for other people, than they were on the original form of it. Original tournaments, you used sharp weapons, you used real lances, you rode against your knightly foes, and your goal was to try to take as many hostages as possible during that fight in order to ransom them, just as you would in warfare, for the financial benefit of it and to raise your own status in that world. William Marshal is going to go to his first tournament with his lord William of Tankerville. In the 11th hour, his lord William is going to provide him with a new warhorse to replace the one lost at Neufchâteau. And in his very first tournament, William Marshal is going to capture 2 noble opponents and get quite a rich ransom for each of them. And it is going to set him on the path for knightly glory that is going to become the rest of his life, because William Marshal becomes the tournament champion of his day. His sort of trademark patented move in tournament fighting would be to ride into a melee and to grab his opponent's reins out of their hand and to ride out of combat, pulling them and their horse behind him. An exceptional feat of horsemanship and strength to be able to do that. One of the things that you see both mentioned in terms of William Marshal's own lifetime and in other accounts from the time, if you read the actual Arthurian romances, which are first written down during this time period, what is remarked upon by knights in combat are their ability to ride well and their strength and fortitude in inflicting blows upon their opponents. You rarely hear their skill in doing it mentioned. It is more described as the feat of strength and being able to physically batter your opponent. Now, that doesn't mean that their weapons weren't effective, that there certainly was skill involved in using them and using them well, but being able to use them strongly certainly was thought of, at least in the contemporary literature, as being one of the most important skills in being able to do that. So William Marshal is going to go on this tournament circle. He is going to do quite well in his initial circuit of the tournaments. And he is going to make his early fortune. And once he has sort of set himself up enough with enough financial security, he is then going to look for a new lord to serve. And he would have had a couple of options. He could have gone, his father had died by this point, he could have gone to his older brother, another John Marshal, in which case he would have probably served his entire life as a household knight, probably would have been successful, but it would have been unlikely that we would know anything about him today. Instead, he chooses to go with his maternal uncle and ask Patrick, who is Earl of Salisbury, if he can serve with him. And Patrick is going to find a place in his military family for William Marshal. As Earl of Salisbury, Lord Patrick is very closely connected to the English royal family. And it's going to be under that umbrella that William Marshal is going to serve in his next military capacity. And that is going to be in helping put down revolutions in Poitou in 1168. So Earl of Salisbury is going to be called to serve under Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry, the old king, Henry II of England, very much at this period in his rule, uses Eleanor of Aquitaine to rule areas that he personally is not overseeing. We can't think of the world that Henry II ruled as being a country or a nation. It was a coalition. It was a conglomerate of smaller duchies, counties, and kingdoms that all fell under one man, Henry II. And he, in official titles, he is the King of England. He is the Duke of Normandy. He is the Count of Anjou. So each of these different pieces have different titles, and they're not necessarily connected under one kind of government. And so Henry II's rule as Richard and John and everyone else under him will be as well, at least in this period, is very much transitory. He's moving about his entire domain. And through much of his kingship, he is going to use Eleanor of Aquitaine to very capably rule areas that he is not personally in. Being from Aquitaine, being the direct liege of Poitou, Eleanor is going to directly oversee those areas and help provide control over that region. And it's in this role that William Marshal is going to be serving in the conflict that occurs in 1168. Now, from the sense of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II and their perspective going into this, the real combat, as far as they're concerned, has already ended. Poitou the rebellion in Poitou has been put down. It is simply restoring government, restoring control and order that needs to be done. That, however, is not the point of view of one of the noble families in Poitou, the Lusignans. If you've been to other of these presentations, you've heard about the Lusignans before. Arguably the most famous, Guy of Lusignan, king of Jerusalem, loses the Battle of Hattin and loses the city of Jerusalem before the Third Crusade. Same family, same individuals. They were, we would think of them today as Southern French. They certainly wouldn't think of themselves as being Southern French. They were Poitevin barons in their own right, and they were not very happy with being ruled by the Angevins. And so they launched several failed rebellions. And at the tail end of this one, they are actually going to end up trying to, well, it's hard to tell what they were trying to do, arguably to capture and hold Eleanor of Aquitaine for ransom. They're going to ambush her and her guards, who are the military forces under Patrick of Salisbury, including William Marshal, in April of 1168. It is a surprise attack. Earl Patrick and most of the knights are unarmed. They're not wearing their armor, although they would have weapons with them. Their military equipment is being carried with the procession, but they're not wearing it. And when this attack happens, there's a flurry of activity as Patrick and his knights have to make the decision. Do I get my armor on, or do I immediately go into battle? Fighting in armor is profoundly safer than fighting without armor. A knight at this point with his entire armor on, both leg armor and his mail hauberk, was, I mean, not invulnerable, but pretty close. It took a very deliberate, dedicated attack to kill you if you were wearing full armor. And where you see it happen is in cases of lucky weapon strikes or of individuals ganging up on their opponents, rather than being a normal feature of combat between fully armored knights. And that's why you could have tournaments with sharpened weapons and not have everybody die. People did, but it was not as deadly as we think of it today. Particularly, I mean, we're fed a healthy dose of movie images of people with swords cutting through male armed arms and legs, which is not possible. You cannot cut through chainmail. It is not physically possible. You can break bones underneath of it. You can certainly hurt an individual, but you're not going to cut through it. You might stab through it, but you're not going to cut. So Eleanor's guards are going to have to make personal decisions. Do I get my armor on or do I not? William Marshal did get at least his hauberk on. I'm reasonably sure he did not get his mail chasse on, the mail leggings. Speaking from experience, you can throw on your hauberk in 30 seconds. It takes a lot longer to get your mail chasses actually pointed and attached in a way to be useful. And if you do it wrong, you cannot ride a horse and you are not going to be able to fight well on foot. His lord, Earl Patrick of Salisbury, is, depending on which source you read, either not going to be able to get his armor on or be in the process of putting on his hauberk when he is going to be fatally struck with a lance in his back and will be killed. Killing an earl in 1168 is a big deal. Capturing the Queen of England certainly would have been effective for the Lusignans. Capturing a bunch of knights for ransom certainly would have provided them with support for their rebellion. Actually killing an earl is going to bring the whole might of Henry II, the old king, down upon them. And so you can almost imagine if it were a movie, it would go into slow motion right when that lance penetrates Earl Patrick's back. He is killed. William Marshal is going to get his hauberk on and is going to fight. He is going to end up, though, being stabbed through his thigh. By the accounts that we have, he backed himself up against the hedgerow and was fighting his opponents to the front while somebody snuck around behind and managed to stab through the hedge into his thigh. Again, probably not wearing his mail shows. And is going to be taken prisoner by the Lusignans. But Earl Patrick's sacrifice and William Marshal's combat is going to be enough to allow Eleanor of Aquitaine to escape. And she is going to do so. And William Marshal is going to be taken into captivity. And by all standards, although he had been a relatively successful tournament champion and made some money, as a prisoner of the Lusignans after this ambush, William Marshal's life is very much in doubt because there is no one really to ransom him. His lord, Earl Patrick, has been killed. Would Earl Patrick's wife ransom one of his new household knights? That's debatable. William Marshal could have sent word to his brother John for ransom. Would his brother actually spend any capital in ransoming a brother who was off fighting for someone else? Unlikely. There doesn't seem to have been a lot of brotherly love between the two individuals. We don't get the sense that it would have been done just out of love. But William Marshal is going to be ransomed, and he's going to be ransomed directly by Eleanor of Aquitaine. I would absolutely love to know why Eleanor of Aquitaine would have ransomed a young household knight in the service of a lord who is protecting her, what her motivations would be. And there's a number of possible ones. Of course, anytime Eleanor of Aquitaine is mentioned, the salacious comes with it. And so there have been suggestions that maybe there was at least admiration, if not actual affection, between the queen and a young household knight. I find that doubtful. It would have been dangerous for both of them, even if the inclination had been there. Whether simply the fact that she knew that he had sacrificed himself to allow her to escape, that is certainly a compelling reason for why she might have ransomed him, or just having been in his presence, seeing that this was an individual who was worth having around, that his qualities were already evident at that point, certainly might have given cause. But Eleanor of Aquitaine is going to personally ransom William Marshal. And in doing that, he is going to go and serve directly in her household. And what she is going to decide is that the best use for young William Marshal is to appoint him as her son's military tutor for Henry the Young King. And so from a relatively lowly household knight, William Marshal is going to become the military instructor to the future King of England. Now, spoiler alert, Henry the Young King is never going to rule on his own, but he is going to be, as I mentioned, crowned as king during his father, the old king's lifetime. So it's fair to say that he served a king of England, even though that king did not necessarily rule on his own. But as part of doing this, there is a profound sense, and Henry the Young King today is often portrayed as being vain and frivolous and throwing away much um, for gaining very little during his lifetime, which is probably not a particularly fair understanding of him as an individual. There are going to be moments where Henry the Old King is going to put Henry the Young King in positions to help quell rebellions or rule areas that are being particularly fractious, which he probably would not do if there was no if there were no signs that Henry the Young King would be successful in ruling them. But there is a sense that one of William Marshal's roles as the household knight to the young king was not only to tutor him in military ability, which William Marshal clearly had shown by this point that he possessed, but also to provide a sort of mature and thoughtful tempering presence to a young man who was being given great power and maybe needed a conscience sitting on his shoulder, shall we say? Let me see if. Okay, so a couple of great things in the chat. As far as the military rank of the Marshal, it does, but it does not during his or his father's lifetime. It would have been, I don't know if it was his grandfather or great-grandfather who actually served as a Marshal to the King of England. The term Marshal implies, at least originally, being in charge of horses. Later, it's used as sort of the military commander, as a military commander's title. William Marshal and his family used it as a surname during their lifetime without serving in the official government role of a marshal. And so, although particularly later in his life, he would serve that role without necessarily that title. So it's kind of, the answer is kind of yes and no at the same time. The other question, could an arrow from a longbow penetrate plate armor? That is a topic that has been under great debate and under great research for a long time. I'm not going to give a hard and fast answer to that. An arrow from a longbow certainly could be a threat to a knight who was wearing plate armor, because not every part of your body can be covered by a plate. Because simply being hit with an arrow, even if it doesn't penetrate your armor, can still cause issues. Because having your horse killed out from under you has an effect, even if the arrow hasn't hurt you as a person. Because there are accounts during the 100 Years' Wars of arrows that penetrate the sides of visors from helmets. What exactly that means is under great debate. So I can't give a hard and fast. There have been lots of modern tests with modern equipment trying to see if a longbow arrow can penetrate plate armor. There's a lot that can go wrong with that kind of modern testing, because unless you are a medieval longbow archer from the 13th, 14th, or 15th century who is trained to that role using the exact type of longbow they would have used against someone wearing the exact type of armor that would have existed, it is hard to actually make a fair comparison. So that's the best answer I can give for that question. Maybe the effect of medieval weapons can be its own presentation, and we can talk about some of those kinds of issues in the future. Longbows, as we understand them today, would probably have existed during William Marshal's time, but certainly would not have been common. The average bow, as we would think of a self bow today, being used in William Marshal's lifetime, would have been unlikely. It would have been unlikely to have had the ability to penetrate his mail armor. Crossbows certainly could have, and certainly existed during his lifetime, and could have penetrated the armor. That doesn't mean they always did, but they could have the ability to do so. But that's talking about weapon effects, even with modern weapons. is a very challenging conversation to have. Suffice to say, by the time you get plate-armed knights fighting against people using the fully developed English longbow, you have the battles of Crécy and Agincourt, where English archers defeat French forces. And whether or not those arrows were able to penetrate the armor, that method of fighting with those weapons was able to defeat fully armored French knights. So as in terms of war fighting, it doesn't really matter what the impact of that weapon on that individual is. As a weapon system, it's doing its job. Archers have not quite gained the ability during William Marshal's lifetime to dominate the battlefield in that way. They have their moments, as we'll see, but they don't dominate it in the same way that the traditional English longbowmen will. Hopefully that provides some context and some answers. And my apologies. I am always challenged with simple, easy answers because these questions are rarely simple and easy to answer. And so there's lots of pieces to think about when any of this kind of information is discussed. All right, so William Marshal is going to serve the young king from 1170 to 1183. It is going to be a chaotic world that he is going to serve in. So Henry the Young King is going to have several rebellions against his father during this time. Henry the Old King was really good at giving his sons titles and giving them at least theoretical claims to land, all except, at least initially, John, hence Lackland. But he was really bad at actually giving them any kind of control over the regions themselves, particularly Henry the Young King. And usually the reason that is given for that in modern stories is that he had found Henry the Young King as wanting for being able to control that power. I'm not sure that's the case. I think because Henry the Young King was directly in position to gain the Duchy of Normandy as well as become King of England, Henry wasn't going to give him control of those regions because those were the sources of Henry's own power, Henry the Old King's own power. And so clearly Henry the Young King bristled at being crowned King of England and Duke of Normandy without being able to actually serve in any controlling capacity over any of them. Henry the Old King was very begrudging in giving Henry the Young King sources of income to support the Young King's own military family, to allow him to have his own largesse with his followers. And that was another point where there was conflict between them. So within that, there are going to be several rebellions that occur. Arguably, the most dramatic of them is going to be the first one from 1173 to 1174, because this is going to be very much a family affair. Henry the Young King, his brother Richard, who will later be the Lionheart, his brother Geoffrey, who is the Count of Brittany at this point, are all going to be involved with Louis of France in fighting against their father, the Old King. And in addition to the sons, their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, is also going to support them and is going to be captured in that conflict. The sons all get forgiven, possibly begrudgingly, but probably not. Henry seemed to expect his sons to have rebellions against him if they weren't willing to fight for what they thought was their own share. What kind of lords would they make themselves, I suppose? So that was understood. But the idea that a wife would also rebel against her husband was taken quite differently. And this will be the start of Eleanor of Aquitaine's imprisonment under Henry II. And she will essentially remain in confinement, initially quite strict, as time goes on, freer and freer until the time of his death, Henry the Old King's death, and is never truly forgiven. It's kind of the breaking of their ways. Up until that point, at least outwardly, Henry the Old King and Eleanor of Aquitaine worked in the same direction, if probably not always aligned. And after that, that will be shattered and never sort of be reclaimed. Although her part of the story is certainly not done. But clearly, after these rebellions, Henry the Young King is very much reined in and is essentially not given any control of anything in terms of direct power. And it is during this time that he and William Marshal are going to return to the tournament fields in France. Now, there were not tournaments in England during this period. Henry II didn't like tournaments. He thought they were a waste of time and a waste of resources and a waste of essentially soldiers. He was much more interested in the actual business of running his empire than he was in tournaments. But his son certainly becomes, Henry the Young King becomes essentially the tournament star, or at least pretty boy of the period, with the coaching of William Marshal, who is essentially, Henry the Young King runs the team, or at least fronts the team, whereas William Marshal is doing the coaching and actually figuring out how they're going to be successful and win their moments. And it's going to be an extended period of time that they go on the tournament circuit. Henry the Young King is going to spend absolutely astronomical amounts of money on his tournament team. And even the period of accounts describe them as being spectacular, with armor that gleamed, with the best military equipment, with the finest tents. If you can think of professional sports stars today, that is kind of the life they're living at this point. But that experience is going to fade, and there's going to be continued conflict, real conflict, in the Young King's life and in William Marshal's life. This time, it is actually going to start with the Young King's brother Richard. And there's going to be a second rebellion starting in 1182, which at least initially starts as a dispute between Richard and Henry the Young King. Henry the Young King is going to side with some of the Poitevin lords who are unhappy with Richard I's rule. Richard I was a hard man to be ruled by if you weren't doing what Richard I wanted, because he was, without a doubt, the best military general of his lifetime, and understood all the elements of medieval warfare. Richard I did not fight in tournaments. He did not see the point because he spent his life fighting in real war and causing real havoc. And so under that rule, it was easy for Henry the Young King. Either he was sought out or he sought out the Poitevin lords under Richard to create trouble. And a second rebellion is going to break out, initially between the two sons, but Henry the Old King is going to have to pick a side. And for a number of reasons, Henry approaches a castle that the Young King's troops are holding. They fire arrows at the Old King's party, whether it was mistaken identity or attempted assassination, nobody knows, or whether through other means, Henry the Old King is going to side with Richard rather than Henry the Young King. During this period, William Marshal is actually going to be exiled from the Young King's military family. William Marshal is accused of having an affair with the Young King's wife. Is there any truth to this? I mean, we don't know. I would, given the way that William Marshal lives the rest of his life, I would think it would be extremely foolhardy of him to put himself into that situation. If you were someone of William Marshal's status in that medieval world and you wanted female companionship, you could find female companionship. There was a traveling brothel that traveled with the court. There was a role in the king's household of the keeper of the royal horse. That was the world in which they lived. William Marshal, in terms of actual relationships, we don't know his sexual preferences or anything like that. But we do know that in terms of relationships that he maintained, they were maintained with fidelity, and that he didn't, whether they were deep and passionate or not, he did not allow those kinds of passions to interfere with keeping his role in society where it needed to be, if that makes sense. And so it's probably unlikely, but at least the young king believed it enough to send William Marshal away. And it is going to be essentially, William Marshal is going to return to the young king's service forgiven, but just in time for Henry the young king to die. And he is going to die of dysentery in 1183, kills many military commanders of the day, bad water supplies, largely to blame. And Henry the young king is really going to die in agony. And he is going to, as he did with so much of the rest of his life, it is a sad waste that his death becomes, but he turns it into its own pageantry. He has himself dragged to the floor with a noose around his neck in penitent forgiveness. He gifts his possessions to his military family. And as part of this, he is also going to make William Marshal promise to complete an oath that he himself is not going to be able to serve, and that is to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so after the young king's death, and Henry the young king's death hit Henry the old king quite hard. And it raised all of these issues of who is in power and who is not again. Because all of a sudden, if Richard is the eldest son, he is going to become King of England. But does he become the Duke of Normandy? Does he retain control of the Aquitaine? So there's all kinds of political upheaval that is going on at this, because of the young king's death, in addition to the personal upheavals that are going on with William Marshal. But William Marshal is going to ask the old king, Henry the old king, if he can go on this pilgrimage. Henry the old king is going to say that he can, and that William Marshal will have a place in the king's household when he returns. And so for a period of 2 years, William Marshal is going to be a crusader. Now, depending on your perspective, William Marshal has either the best or the worst timing possible in when he chooses to become a crusader, because in the time period that he is in the Holy Land, there is not a whole lot happening. Given the events that happened before and afterwards, for William Marshal personally, in some ways, that may have been a good thing, because it's going to be right after William Marshal leaves, although not because of that in any way, shape, or form, that Hattin is going to be fought, and the Jerusalem is going to be lost. And certainly there's conflict before he arrives. But in the time period in which he is in the Holy Land, although there is raiding, although there certainly is conflict around the borders, there is not open hostility or warfare. I would be fascinated, because he's at the same period where you have the rise of the Lusignans, the same people that had held him prisoner in Poitou, gaining power. I mean, this is the background. Like, if you are familiar at all with what's the movie? I'm losing my Kingdom of Heaven. This is the time period in which, it's right before the time that movie attempts to depict that William Marshal is in the Holy Land. So it's that family, the Lusignans, who had him as a prisoner in Poitou, who are working behind the scenes to gain power at the time that William Marshal is there. So it'd be interesting to know if there was any animosity there or not. But in addition to this, William Marshal is going to make connections with the Templars, who he is going to have close connections with. It's interesting that he chooses personally not to become a Templar himself at this point. But he certainly makes a connection with them. Whether it was an appreciation of one soldier to another or not is hard to say. And he is also going to be connected to a world of vastly different kind of luxuries than he would be exposed to in Western Europe. And one of the things that he is going to bring back from the Holy Land is he's going to bring back 2 bolts of silk, finely made silk, that he's going to put in storage for future use. But in 1185, he is going to return, and he's going to return to serve under Henry II. And I'm going to go back into chat and see. It doesn't seem that we've got any follow-on questions. William Marshal is going to serve in Henry II's court. It's going to be during this point that William Marshal is going to start to get his own estates. And another piece that is connected to that is he's going to get wardships. And very early in his return, so this was if you were a king, you could give, and by all accounts, William Marshal was definitely was forward in arguing for estates and wardships and things of that nature. I mean, he didn't just sit there and allow them to come to him. He very much was angling for them himself. He was working the system to his own benefit. Some have seen that as being very self-serving. Others just, I mean, accept that that's the world in which he lived. If you wanted to advance yourself, that's what you did. It would be no different than sort of working the corporate ladder today to increase your own position. But if you were a king and you wanted to support one of your vassals during this period, 2 ways that you could do that is either by giving them estates of their own or by giving them wardships. And what wardships were is if you were a young noble before the age of your majority and your parents had died, you were placed in the wardship of the crown. And it would be up to the crown then to oversee that wardship. And what that meant is that while you were a ward of the crown, the king was getting all the revenue from your lands. And if you were the king, you could then give that wardship to someone else, or someone else could pay for the pleasure of that wardship. And the same thing occurred with titles. If you were granted a title, you often gave the king a gift for that title. You can make the case that you're buying them, but that's how the system worked. If you were made or given a ward, that could mean several different things. You could certainly just raise that person until their majority, bank whatever income came from their estates, and just go on with your knightly, lordly life and do what you needed to do. Or if you were given as a wardship, if a woman was placed in your wardship, a girl for all intents and purposes, one of the possible expectations is that you would marry them, and then that would be a political advantage to gaining your own lands. And that's may have been what was intended when William Marshal was given the wardship of Eloise of Lancaster, is that he would marry her himself, and that would give him claims to the titles and the lands that were her dowry, and were in her family through her. He did not. He did not marry her. He does help provide find a suitable husband for her. This sounds callow to our modern mind, like, you know, especially because often cases these are 16, 17-year-old, maybe 15-year-old girls who are being married off to far older men who are their wards, and all of this has a very much a negative view in our minds today. It was certainly the accepted principles of the time. I'm not saying that as a throwaway. it's been interesting. There have been some sociological studies, particularly of medieval marriage. In many ways, we today view our ability to find relationships and find partners as being far more open to the world than they often in reality are. We tend to find relationships from people much in our own social groups or economic groups or worlds, because that's the nature of the people that we interact with and we make connections with. That was certainly true of the medieval world as well. If you were a young woman who was a ward, the expectation was that whoever was was holding the wardship would find a successful match for you. And in the systems of medieval marriage, women had a lot more power than they would later on in later marriages, particularly in terms of the consent required to be married in the first place. Yes, you can make cases that, you know, it would be hard to not consent to a marriage that you probably had little choice in. Fair, absolutely fair. But I just want to give the caution that it's often we interpret historical relationships through a viewpoint that they themselves would not have understood. Now, if you were given a ward who was a son, in William Marshal's case, John of Early, you were then responsible for their military training and for sort of protecting and overseeing their growth in their career as a knight themselves. And that is going to be very much the case with William Marshal. John of Early, who is placed as a ward in William Marshal's household, will serve in what we would think of today as a squire to him. He will be knighted by William Marshal. He will be connected to William Marshal for the remainder of William Marshal's life as one of his military family and supporting him. And be given control of estates and castles that William Marshal will eventually have control over to defend in his own right. And so certainly there was a connection between them of mentor and loyalty that lasted through the remainder of their lives moving forward. During this time, there's going to be a lot of turmoil in the English royal family. Geoffrey of Anjou, Henry the Old King's son, and at this point, the Count of Brittany is going to die in a tournament in 1186. He is going to leave a son, Arthur, although Arthur will never know his father. Constance of Brittany is pregnant with Arthur at the time of Geoffrey's death. So there will, sort of not be any direct connection, but they're both that connection is going to feature during John's reign later on. But as is the case with much of the story of the Angevins, the Capetian rulers of France are going to be doing everything they can to undermine Henry II's rule. And in this case, it is going to be Philip of France, later known as Philip Augustus, who is going to court Richard, later to be the Lionheart, to struggle directly against his father, Henry II. There are going to be more rebellions. In this case, it's going to be Richard against Henry. And Henry is not doing well at this point. Henry the Old King is ill. He is dying throughout the period of this war. He is also fighting against Richard I, who is a far more effective military commander than Henry the Young King ever was, than anyone else of his age. And at the city of Le Mans in 1189, Richard is going to manage to ford a river that is supposed to be unfordable and take a town out from under Henry II that was thought to be impregnable, so much to the point where many of Henry's household knights did not even put on their armor the day that the attack came through, because they didn't think there was any possible way that Richard and the rebels could cross the river and attack. But they are successful in doing so. And in the rear, yes.
Can I interfere a little bit? I apologize. Let me ask you, because it seems that I actually enjoy very much, and especially all the details you give, and you know, there are some questions along the way. It looks to me that it's still a lot to go to the end of his, and I was wondering if you would consider to maybe have a little like a stop at some point and maybe come at another date and continue this, because it's wonderful, but I wouldn't want you to rush. Am I correct in saying that? What do you think?
I'm thinking about 15 minutes. Now,
Okay.
I could certainly do a second take with more detail. But the story speeds up at this point because we've got all the pieces in place.
Oh, okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
And again, I'm always happy to come back if we want to do more of like the Barons' War and that in detail. We certainly can. But it's going to be in the rear guard action here that William Marshal and Richard I are going to face each other in single combat. William Marshal is leading the rear guard. Richard I is riding ahead in many respects of the rest of the forces, as Richard often did. The stories of the interaction are that Richard was not fully armed, not wearing his full armor. And so as he saw William Marshal bearing down on him fully armed with lance, that he yelled to William Marshal, "God's legs, Marshal, don't kill me." And at the last minute, William Marshal is going to shift the aim of his lance from Richard I to Richard's horse and kill Richard the Lionheart's horse out from under him before riding away. Shortly after this, Henry II is going to die. There's going to be a tense moment between Richard I and William Marshal when Henry II dies, where Richard is basically going to say, "You almost killed me back there, except that I parried your blow at the last moment." And William Marshal effectively is going to say, "You did not. I shifted my aim. If I had intended to kill you, I would have killed you." And Richard will accept that. And not only will do that, but he is going to give William Marshal another ward. And this is going to be Isabel de Clare, the Lady of Strigel, who is going, in this case, William is going to take the advantage of marrying Isabel of Clare. And they are going to have an amazing partnership through the rest of our lives. For all that this was a wardship that turned into a marriage that we might not think of as an equal relationship today, William Marshal is going to give his wife great power in terms of ruling areas in her own right. She was the heiress of the day, because with her comes not only huge amounts of land along the Welsh border, but also great lands in Ireland as well. And the two of them are going to work together throughout the rest of their lives in ruling this great swath of land. There are going to be periods where William Marshal is going to be absent, and she is going to totally rule their lands in Ireland in her own right. They will have 5 children together. Their children don't have happy lives, but that does not happen during their own lifetimes. Everything looks good up until their deaths, and then pretty much all of their children are going to end up dying young. But as part of this, Richard is going to get into conflict with Count John, who is now Count of Anjou, who also is Lord of Ireland. And there's going to be friction between the two of them. And while Richard is off in the Holy Land, there is a lot of tension between William Marshal and John. And William Marshal is in some ways going to side with John against some of the advisors that Richard I has left behind in England. William Marshal was very much a political animal. He knew if anything happened to Richard in the Holy Land, or indeed afterwards, that John was arguably the best set up to be the King of England. And so it is probable that he was trying to walk the line of doing what needed to be done without angering the person who would be the next ruler of England. And so when Richard Lionheart is killed by a crossbow bolt at the siege of Challis in 1199, the question comes to William Marshal, who do you support? There are two possible claimants to the throne. There is the young man, Arthur of Brittany, and there is the older soldier, although you can debate how effective he was, John, who is in his prime. And William Marshal is going to make the decision to support John. And in these conversations, he is going to be told by the bishop that he is basically debating this question with, you will never regret anything as much as what you are doing right now. Probably true, but I'm not sure what other options William Marshal had at the moment. William Marshal
can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Quick. Did Eleanor of Aquitaine had anything to do with it? Because she's obviously would support John.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's either supporting her son or her grandson.
Yeah, but it looks like John was her darling.
She
John
very
was
much
her darling, right?
No, Richard was her darling.
No, I know,
John,
but after Richard, though,
it's debatable. It's hard to see into people's hearts, you know, hundreds of years later.
Okay.
She very much acted throughout this period as a moderating force for, you know, when there was conflict with Richard the First's crusade, when there was conflict in England over who was in charge and what was going on, she remained as a moderating force with William Marshal. One can only think back to, you know, the young William Marshal who fought for a queen who, you know, he's now helping to, you know, keep peace in what's, you know, a very unpeaceful land at this point. And Eleanor of Aquitaine is going to be a very much a moderating influence on John up until her death. If she had lived longer and had able to continue moderating John, things might have transgressed very differently. William Marshal is going to do pretty well by John at first. They're going to have lots of tension and argument in their own rights, but it is safe to say that no one remained a more dedicated supporter of King John than William Marshal, as he served all of his kings. So when Richard dies and John becomes king, immediately Philip of France throws in his support with Arthur of Brittany. Basically, Philip of France threw his support in with whoever was second in line for King of England at this point, because it was in his best interest to do so. There's going to be conflict. John is going to secure the most impressive military victory of his entire reign in August of 1202, the Battle of Mirabeau, where he is going to not only relieve the siege of the castle at Mirabeau, but capture Arthur of Brittany in the fighting. Arthur of Brittany will never be seen alive again, essentially, on the world stage. He undoubtedly died in captivity under King John. At the time, it was widely believed that King John perhaps even personally killed him. It is likely that he was murdered as an opponent. And this is, although the actual next claimant to the kingship of England is dead and no longer in the picture, this is going to create a whole new reason for Philip Augustus of France to wage war against John, because as Duke of Normandy, King John of England is the vassal of the King of France for Normandy. Arthur of Brittany was the vassal of the King of France for Brittany. So the King of France can say, no, you need to produce the Count of Brittany, and when you can't do it, you have violated your duties as my vassal. I can fight against you. There are going to be other reasons why John gives Philip Augustus reason to hold him in contempt. And eventually, the war is going to go poorly against John, and John is going to lose all of his lands on the continent, pretty much, to Philip of France. This is going to directly lead into what is known as the First Barons' War and the First Magna Carta War. William Marshal is going to continue to support John. He is going to spend most of the Magna Carta War keeping the Welsh borders and Ireland out of the war, rather than directly serving himself. Interestingly enough, William Marshal's oldest son, William Marshal the second, Jr., I suppose, is going to serve with the rebels. Whether this was because whether this was a calculated move, hey, we've got somebody in each camp, or whether it was sort of the individual wills of each of them, certainly can be debated. But it is going to be during the end of the Barons' War that William Marshal is going to have his arguably finest moment on the battlefield, and that is going to be the Battle of Lincoln in 1217. Now you have to remember, he's in his 70s at this point, and he leads the assault in relieving the siege on Lincoln personally. He's actually forced to stop by one of his military family and told to put his helmet on because he's getting ready to charge into action with his helmet off. But he is going to manage to relieve the siege of Lincoln, which is one of two moments that is going to essentially destroy the rebel and French kings. Well, three things that is going to destroy the rebels and French kings and French princes' ability to continue this rebellion. The other two things, there's going to be a naval battle, which destroys the ability of the French to continue to bring reinforcements to try to aid the rebels. And arguably the most important factor in ending the First Baron War is the fact that John is dead, and there is very little reason for the rebels to continue fighting with the French against their own people, because the whole reason for their struggle, King John, is no longer in position. So for the next 2 years following the end of the Barons' War, William Marshal is going to serve as regent of England for the young King Henry III. So effectively ruling England for his king for 2 years before retiring due to his health. He is going to die in 1219, and on his death, William Marshal is going to become a Templar himself and be invested as a Knight Templar, which right before taking his vows as a Templar, he will tell Isabel to kiss him as a wife one last time, because becoming a Templar, he will have to end their marriage, as he will then be a warrior monk. And he is buried wrapped in the silk that he had brought from the Holy Land during his time on crusade. Isabel is not going to live much longer. She is going to die the year afterwards, reasonably young, at least compared to her husband. I'm not sure that we know the exact causes of that. But as you can see, with William Marshal's 5 sons, William, Richard, Gilbert, Walter, and Ansel, none of them are going to live past 1245. They just did not have the fortunes of a long life in the medieval period. So the image in the picture you see at the left, this is the effigy attributed to William Marshal in the Temple Church in London. The effigy to the right is attributed to one of his sons. There's lots of debate as to whose effigies whose, but William Marshal's one to the left is pretty well believed to be his actual, based on the early military equipment. Interestingly, it's one of the earliest effigies in England for a knightly grave. And unfortunately, we have the Nazis to thank for the damage to it, because it was heavily damaged in the bombing of during the Blitz of the Temple Church. So if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. I am happy to answer them. If you're interested in medieval hijinks and living history, I highly encourage checking out our medieval group, the Company of Little Dunmow. We try to portray the Barons' War as best we can. one of the few groups here in the United States that tries to very richly portray the period of the Magna Carta. And if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me and ask, and I will be only too happy to answer them to the best of my abilities. William Marshal, yes, through his daughter's lines. Although his sons did not live particularly long, his daughters made pretty good marriages. I mean, his ancestry goes into the British royal line afterwards. Off the top of my head, I can't give you the path. But if you are interested in, so recently published, there was a book, Ladies of Magna. Ladies of Magna Carta really does an amazing job of looking at all the connections between the individuals in this society. And they're all interconnected through marriage and through families and through knowing each other. And so it has chapters on the Marshal's daughters. But unfortunately, I can't remember their connections. But thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Great presentation. Really enjoyed it. Fantastic. A lot of details. I had a quick question, just
Please.
for my personal, as far as Templars are concerned. Like once you become a Knight Templar, can you later on withdraw from that?
I don't know. I would have to research that. So I know if you're following the Benedictine order would say that would allow you, if you choose to renounce your oaths as a monk, you could do so. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be sort of social interactive consequences to that, but it was acknowledged in the Benedictine order that you could do that. As far as the Knights Templar were concerned, I don't have a good answer for that. What the consequences would be for trying to leave it. So I know some individuals who are far more have far more knowledge of the military orders than I do. Jonathan might know, and there's some other individuals that I can ask, but I don't know off the top of my head.
I think I allowed people to unmute themselves. I'm not sure if it's happening, but if anybody has more questions, let's see. Or you could put it in the chat if anyone has. Did it work? No, I don't know.
I know that I have control, but I don't.
Yeah.
I'm muting, but.
Okay. I'll try that. Allow oh, okay. Yeah, I think I did this. Yeah, I think I allowed people to unmute.
Excellent.
So please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask questions if you want to.
Anyone?
Yeah, I can see people unmute. Okay. Any? Okay, any questions? Anybody?
Well, again, if you have any, don't hesitate to get in touch with me through any of the various paths, and I will be happy to answer what questions I can.
I just want to say thank you. This was incredibly interesting.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Andrew, I have a question specifically about the who had the right to succeed between the Arthur and John, because I was on the impression that it depends on the branch takes precedence. I mean, the Joffrey was an older brother of John, so technically it looks like Arthur had a precedence over John, if I understand it correctly. But what do you think?
That certainly was how succession was understood on the continent. It gets more complicated in England because even through Richard's lifetime, the understanding of who succeeds is who is given the succession from the previous king. So there are points in Richard I's lifetime where he declares Arthur will be his successor, and there are points where he declares John will be his successor. Now, for as far as Stephen and Matilda are concerned, it's a good image because often the person who is the successor is the person who can be coronated first and get control of the treasury first. Because it doesn't matter what rights you claim, once the holy chrism is placed on the forehead, and once you have the resources of the kingdom behind you, it's really hard. It's really hard. It takes someone as incompetent in kingship as Stephen to lose at that point. I'm fascinated by King Stephen, but he was just too nice. He was too nice of a guy. He gave too much away in his early kingship, and it allowed Matilda to continue the anarchy. If he had been Henry II or Richard I, never would have let things get so far as to allow Matilda to come back, had that been the case. Matilda was much more ruthless than Stephen was, which is why the anarchy lasted as long as it did. But that's going to be true for is it? I'm forgetting my trivia now. It might be that Henry III might be the first English monarch in generations who is the eldest son of his father and becomes king. Because Richard's not the eldest son, and although he has the direct line there, and Henry wasn't the eldest son of Stephen, and so the idea that the natural direct eldest son or the eldest son of the eldest son would become king, there hadn't been a chance really in England under Norman control for that to happen.
Right. What about Edward, the son of Henry? Was he the oldest? The Edward Longshanks,
yes,
right?
I believe so.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's so. Then,
I mean, John was not a particularly good king, and Henry III was not a particularly good king, although he started off better.
yeah, but Edward the First was, right?
He was certainly a mighty and a hard king. If you he was a great king by medieval standards, we'll put it that way. Although he costs England a lot. I mean, the warrior kings that even they admired at the time, like Richard I and Edward I, certainly were not political or social or economic champions the way that we would think of as a nation's leader would need to be today. You can't be a incredibly successful military commander in the Middle Ages without economically harming your lands in some way or another.
Right.
Of course, but you could also be John and be a relatively incompetent military commander and harm your lands even more.
Well, John, yeah, by the way, John, his name Lackland is, you think because he lost all the lands in France, or
no,
is it because he didn't inherit any?
Because in the very first record of it, supposedly he was called Lackland by his father. Henry II called him Lackland because
didn't give him any.
Yeah, the young king gets his share, and Richard gets his share, and Geoffrey gets his share. There's nothing left for John. So, you know, there's actually some, unlike his brothers, John is actually raised at Fonteville Abbey. There's some suggestion that he was intended for the church. He's quite a bit younger than, so essentially you've got Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and then a bunch of daughters, and then John. So, and I'm not, please don't think that I'm discounting their daughters who were, there's amazing stories there too. But if we're looking at kingship lines, then their lines of kingship are in other countries, Sicily and southern France and Holy Roman Empire, where they're rulers in their own rights. But there's an age gap there. So John is quite young by the time Henry the Young King kicks off, and so there's now land for John. John's nickname that he gets at the time of the fall of Normandy is Soft Sword.
Right.
And that, you know, Malus Gladium, and that would have had the same, all the same connotations at the time that we could give it today. Not only you are not an effective military commander, but an insult to his manhood.
So what was the William Marshal's stance during the Richard's captivity?
He kept England together.
He kept England together, right? But there was a procrastination on the part of John, getting the ransom and all kinds of. There was some agreements. John's efforts really were more with Henry the Lion and Leopold of Austria in trying to keep Richard, and Philip of France, and trying to keep Richard in prison. John had relatively little influence in the gathering of the ransom in England, because England and most of the Angevin lands are very much under the control of all of the barons, of whom Richard or William Marshal could be considered the first of equals, and still at that point, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who's more than anything else, Eleanor of Aquitaine is responsible for raising the ransom. She made it happen, and William Marshal certainly supported her. When Richard is captured, John tries to ally with Philip of France and essentially tries to, through military arms, take over Normandy. He's not particularly successful, and he's not particularly adventurous in his actions in trying to take control. And so not a lot happens during that period. But that's also kind of John. Like John, when he was on his game, could do amazing things. But John also undid most of his own successes. Only John could legitimately end a war with an overnight march, relieving a castle siege, and then throw it all away by assassinating his nephew. Any of his brothers could have probably navigated that better. There's one historian talks about, you know, that John very much almost always aimed to kick a man when he was down, and in doing so would lose his own balance. All right. Okay. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Please, this is the time. We're coming to the end, I guess.
I mean, feel free to ask questions now, because otherwise I have to go outside and trench water lines to make sure my horses have water over the winter.
Okay. All right, I guess this is it. Thank you very much, Andrew. I mean, very interesting. I personally very much enjoyed it. A lot of information. I'm familiar with the period in general. Get a lot of details, a lot of information. I really appreciate this, and I hope everybody else enjoyed it. I see a lot of people. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk for a couple hours about William Marshal. It's
Yeah,
not
and
hard to, I'm happy to do that.
great, because we really would love to have you more, more often. There are so many topics. Thank you, and hope to see you soon. I know Zach will work with you.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. Hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season, and hope everyone has a good New Year.
Thanks. Goodbye, everyone. Take care. I'm going to end it.